We're talking today with Donald Doyle of Sparta, Michigan, and the interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Okay, Don, start us off with some background on yourself, and to begin with, where and when were you born?
I was born in Grand Rapids, Michigan, but out in the country, rural, so it was on Burton Street, just west of Kennewa, November 22nd, 1946.
Okay, and did you live in that area then while you were growing up, or did you move?
Yeah, we stayed there, and I lived there until I was drafted.
Okay, and what did your family do for a living then?
My dad was a dairy farmer, so we raised cattle and chickens, and we had milk cows.
All right, and then how many kids were in the family?
There was 6 of us, and mother and father.
And then where were you in line?
I was the second from the youngest.
Okay. All right. And so do you grow up, did you help out with the cows and do work in the farm?
Yes, that's why we couldn't play sports, because we had to milk cows every morning and at night, so no room for sports. So.
Okay. And did you finish high school?
Yes.
And what year did you graduate?
1964.
Okay. And then what did you do after you graduated high school?
I went to work for a neighbor that was in the apple orchards, and I worked for him for about 6 months. Then I wound up working for a land and company, and I've worked for them for 53 years now.
Okay, and what do they do?
They build apartment projects, and we did a lot of mobile home parks in the area.
Okay, all right. And now as you start doing this, this is now the period when the Vietnam War is starting to heat up, and we start in '65, we're sending ground troops over there, the draft ramps up. At what point do you wind up in the military?
Well, I went deer hunting in the fall of '65, and when I came back, I had my draft notice on the table.
Okay.
And at that time, I was working for land and company at the time, but they gave me 28 days to show up in the Army, and so I looked at going to the Air Force. They needed more days. Navy said that they could take me in 22 days. So I joined the Navy, but the Navy never told the Army, and then they came looking for me 2 years later, thinking I had deserted to Canada.
Okay. Now, what prompted you to decide to go to the Air Force or Navy instead of the Army?
Well, I didn't have a college education, so I thought I could get more schooling other than being a foot soldier in the Army. So.
Okay.
And I preferred to do 4 years as the 2-year enlistment.
Okay. So you weren't really thinking about Vietnam per se? This was...
I really didn't know that much about it. I mean, it was just starting to heat up then, and I probably would have made a big target in Vietnam. And if I had gone in to the Army as the same profession I'm doing right now, I would have been in a CB, which would have been right in Vietnam. But they put me in a school that taught me machinery repairman.
Right. So if you'd gone in the Navy, you'd have been a CB, because
Yeah, right.
Our Army usually has engineers. Yeah.
Well, yeah, right. Yeah, you're correct.
All right. But basically, you kind of got it. So you were really kind of thinking more about opportunities and
Right.
your own personal development, which is what most people going into the service these days think about is, how does that work for me? Okay. So you pick the Navy, and when you enlisted, were you allowed to express preference for training or request for training schools?
Well, they tested you, and my scores came out fairly good for mechanical, and so I went to Great Lakes for boot camp, and they sent me to A school in San Diego for machinery repairman.
Okay,
So,
let's talk a little bit about Great Lakes for boot camp. When do you arrive there?
it was on the 25th of November, cold, right in the middle of the night. It was like 3 in the morning. We had to take a train from Detroit to Great Lakes.
Okay, and Great Lakes is north of Chicago,
Right.
on Lake Michigan. Okay, and how do they process you, or what kind of reception do you get at Great Lakes?
Well, they let us eat first. We hadn't eaten in quite a while, so then they can't really remember too much about the processing, but I was quite tall at the time, and so they didn't put me in a, well, we had a company that we were in, but they didn't want me marching with the rest of the troops because I would mess up the marching, so they put me in charge of a drill hall. So myself and another guy who was real short wound up running the drill hall all the time we were at Great Lakes.
Okay, so what did that duty consist of?
Just taking care of the drill hall, make sure it was clean, and, you know, arranging for the companies to come in and march, learn drills.
So you didn't get marched around then yourself?
No.
Okay.
And most of the classes I didn't have to go to, like the shooting guns and stuff, which I probably would have liked, but knot tying and stuff like that I didn't have to go to.
Okay. Now, I think, did you also have kind of classroom stuff to do?
Yeah, they did bookwork too, but
Do you remember what that consisted of?
not really. It's been a good 50 years. I know they made us guard dumpsters at night. I don't know why. I guess somebody was afraid that they were going to steal them, but anyway.
So how did you spend your days then in boot camp? I guess you did some of the regular classroom work, but.
Well, we spent most of the time in the drill hall itself, so.
Okay. And how much emphasis was there on discipline and obeying orders, or did you miss most of that too?
Well, they had to break you mentally, and you wound up having anything with gold on it, you saluted. So, I mean, if they weren't even officers, you saluted them. You're better off doing it that way.
Okay. And how easy or hard was it for you to adjust to life in the Navy?
I didn't have a problem with it. The only problem I had was when they made you brush your teeth. They gave you this capsule you were supposed to chew, and then they gave you like a toothpaste, and it was so gritty that you had to hold your head up until all that red was gone out of your mouth. And a lot of the people started puking, and that I smell that smell today. I start to gag, but that was the worst part of boot camp that I can remember.
All right. And how long did boot camp last?
It was only like a month and a half, 2 months.
Okay. And then from there, now you get sent to San Diego for
Right.
for your training. Okay. And what does that consist of?
Mostly learning how to run equipment, like mills and lathes and anything a machinist would do. We would take a piece of metal, raw stock, and make parts out of it. So we did that. Well, the school was 3 months long, but when it was time for me to go on, they sent me orders for a destroyer out of Kodak, Alaska, with the RM instead of MR for machinery repairmen.
So what does RM stand for?
Radioman.
Okay.
And I didn't know anything about being a radioman, so they figured I better wait and get my orders changed, which they did.
Okay, so you
But
did not go to Alaska then?
No. They kept me there at A school for another 2 months, and then I just helped out in the classroom. And then the ship that most of everybody that went through my class at that point in time went to the USS Prairie, and then I wound up going there myself.
Okay. And what was the Prairie?
It was a destroyer tender, AD-15, and it was in Hawaii at the time. So I flew to San Francisco, then flew to Hawaii, saw 2 sunsets that night.
Mm-hmm. All right. And then was the ship in Pearl Harbor, or was it somewhere else?
It was in Pearl Harbor. It was tied up at Ford Island. Most people don't know that there's an island inside the island there, but that's where our tender was tied up, and the destroyers came alongside of us, and they call it battleship roll.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was famous from the Pearl Harbor
Right,
attack
mhm.
and all that. All right. And once you got there, I mean, what did your job consist of?
The first, when I first got there, they had me work in the valve shop, and mostly we worked on valves and running lathes and a vertical turret, VTLs they call them, vertical turret lathes. And then we ran all the equipment that they needed run, so.
Okay. As a new guy, did you get all the junkiest jobs, or did they work you in pretty quickly?
They worked us in pretty quickly. Like I say, they needed stuff done, so we worked on 4-section duty. So every fourth day that we had to work 24 hours, and then we had 3 days off. But usually it was an 8-hour day.
Mm-hmm.
Food was great though.
Yeah, it was the Navy. Yeah. Okay. And do you live on board ship?
Yes.
Okay. What kind of quarters did you have?
We were in the forward part of the ship, and there was probably 100 people in the compartment that we were at. And I stayed there my whole career in the Navy.
Okay. And so how much sort of physical space did you have?
The racks were, there's 3 racks, 2 bunks, or, and I was middle rack, middle rack. Then we had a 4-foot compartment that we kept our clothes in. That's it.
All right. So did you spend most of your time in port, or would you go out regularly to sea?
We would go from port to port. We weren't allowed to go into the war zone. So we went to Hawaii and stayed there 6 months, came back to San Diego, stayed there and refitted, and then we went back to Hawaii and stayed at Pearl for another 6 months. Then we came back and we went through Long Beach to the shipyards, went through dry dock, and then they sent us on 2 Westpac cruises. And we went to Taiwan, the Philippines, Subic Bay, Hong Kong, and Japan. We went to Yokosuka.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Go back to the Hawaii period there. Okay, so you have sort of 1 day on, 3 days off, and you get to go ashore and...
We could do almost anything we wanted to, as long as you had a decent haircut and your shoes were shiny.
Okay. And did you go off the ship much?
Not really. Being out at Ford Island, you had to take a boat in to get to the island or the mainland itself. We did, every once in a while, we would rent a car and go out on the island and spend some time on the beaches.
Mm-hmm.
But I never went off the island itself.
Okay. I never went off Ford Island or never went off Oahu?
Never went off Oahu.
Okay. All right. When you go in Oahu, if you go to Honolulu or the beaches and things like that, could people just look at you and know you were in the Navy?
You were allowed to wear civilian clothes. Of course, your haircut gave you away.
Mm-hmm. And how did people seem to treat or view the servicemen there?
I didn't have any problem at all. And we were treated very nice.
And in turn, how did the servicemen behave when they went to town?
Well, some of them came back drunk quite often. I did stand short patrol quite often there, and we had to deal with the drunks. But the beer was only a dime, and mixed drinks were only a quarter. So I mean, you didn't need much money to get polluted. So.
What were they paying enlisted men?
It
those
was 15 cents an hour. That's what my pay was.
Mm-hmm.
It did go up a little bit once I made E5. But.
Because you're not making much, but you're not spending as much
Right.
as anything else either. So it kind of goes that way. All right. And what, did you have a specific crew or group of guys that you normally worked with, or were you assigned to different people, different shifts?
We pretty much worked together. The valve shop and the machine shop were right next to each other. And so we basically worked together and we hung out together. Then we, had friends in other divisions. We had 56 different shops on the ship, so and the ship was quite large, so it was over 365 feet long, so we had, I think, a total complement of around 850 to 900 people.
Okay. And then, say, within your particular shop, how many of you were there?
There was probably, in the valve shop, probably about 15. In the machine shop, we probably had 25 to 30.
Okay. Now, was that 15 on a shift or 15 total for the whole valve shop?
15 total for the whole
Okay.
valve shop.
So just a few of you working there at any
Right.
given time? Okay. Now, were you getting destroyers that had been on, cruises in Yankee Station and places
Yes.
like that, coming in for?
They would come to us, and most of them were general repair. You know, the equipment's just worn out, so we repaired as much as we could. I did work on the battleship New Jersey. I had to do a helical gear for the forward gun mount, which I thought was quite neat, because they'd let us go on the battleship and get dimensions that we needed for the parts, so.
Now, when you're talking forward gun mount, are you talking about the big turrets or?
Yes,
Okay,
16
16
inches.
inches, okay. Yeah. Okay. Are there particular things that happened in Hawaii or aspects of that job that kind of stand out in your memory?
Well, when we were in Taiwan, one of the person below me where I slept, he opened up a void, which they use for ballast water, and he looked down inside, and he lost his balance, fell into the void, and died. And they did get him out. They had these scuba divers to get him out, but he died, in the Philippines. No, it was Taiwan,
Okay.
Kaohsiung.
Okay. Okay. So so it was like the first time you actually went out to sea.
It was quite lonely. The first time, we came back from Hawaii, it was only like maybe 2 weeks at sea. Then when we went back did the Westpac cruises, that was 28 days that we were at sea. So it was a long time without seeing land. Of course, they always told us land was only a mile down, so.
Right. Okay. Now, when you went to Taiwan, for instance, did you put into port or did you stay out at sea?
We were stationed out in the bay, and then we took Liberty boats in for if we wanted to go ashore.
Okay. And did you do that?
Yeah,
Okay. So what was Taiwan like?
I thought I died and gone to heaven. The women there were just beautiful, and of course I right off the farm, so yeah. The city itself was one of the cleanest places that we went to when I was doing the Westpac cruises. They were still using carts with oxen though, on the main street. So, and their sewer systems were inadequate. They had open sewers right on the street itself.
Okay. Now, so did you have kind of a mix of very modern buildings and things and a lot of older stuff, or did it all seem older?
It all seemed older at the time, but I've seen pictures since then, and I said, where was that?
Yeah, yeah.
Kaohsiung, that I remember. It has changed. It's a metropolis now.
And how did they seem to view Americans?
Taiwan was excellent. They loved Americans there. Japan didn't like us for some reason, other than the fact that we dropped a couple bombs on them. But the Philippines they were quite friendly there. A lot of the people, especially the women, wanted to marry a serviceman, so they treated you really nice there. So.
Okay. Now, did you do shore patrol in any of these places?
I did shore patrol in all the places, yes.
Okay.
I did, in the Subic Bay, I did permanent shore patrol. So I was still on 4-section duty, so we worked one day in Olongapo, and then they put us on an island, Grande Island, in the bay, and they would take us out there, and they had a movie theater, they had a hotel, restaurants, golf courses, and we did a lot of scuba diving. The water there was just crystal clear, so.
Okay. Now, Subic Bay, if you went off the base, that was also a place where people could get into a lot of trouble.
Right.
Did you run into that stuff on shore patrol, or?
Well, when I was there, the mayor had been killed by this other person that wanted to be mayor. The person that killed the mayor barricaded himself into the mayor's office while we were there. And the mayor's wife, the former mayor, had the police behind her, so they attacked and she became mayor. And I met her in the jail that they had down there, and there's probably no bigger than this room here, and there's over 100 people in it. And there was standing room only, but she carried a submachine gun over her shoulder, so that's what we worked with. We always had to work with one of their military, and then they had their own police. We worked side by side.
Okay. And I don't know, what kinds of trouble did American sailors get into? Was it just drunk and disorderly, or?
Mostly drunk and disorderly. Of course, we were enlisted personnel at the time, so we could arrest officers, and they didn't feel that we could arrest them. They had their own opinions, but Shore Patrol had jurisdiction over anybody, any military.
Mm-hmm.
But we ran into a few, but mostly it was alcohol related.
I mean, did you have any situations where really bad things happened to guys, or they went away and didn't come back?
We had one officer that didn't think he could be arrested, so he was standing at the desk, and we told him to put his hands behind his back, and he wouldn't do it, so we had to grab him, and another person pulled his feet out from underneath him, and his teeth hit embedded himself into the desk.
Oh, okay.
Other than that, no, we never had any other problems other than,
Okay. Yeah, so when you're in these foreign ports, I mean, basically, was this just another way for you to support the ships that were on duty over there and doing things mostly in connection with Vietnam, or?
Most of the ships that we were working on were stationed off Vietnam. I never knew anybody that was killed in combat in Vietnam. So, like I say, some of the ships had some damage to them, but most of those were taken back to shipyards and worked in shipyards. But
Yeah.
we were general maintenance, basically.
Yeah. And what you were doing was mid-engine and the different component parts
Right.
of the inside of the ship, so not normally combat stuff anyway. Now, did you, because you're serving in wartime, but you're not directly connected to it.
Right.
Were you just perfectly happy that way, or did you feel at all guilty you weren't doing something else?
I felt that, I was doing what I needed to do to, I did what they asked me to do.
Mm-hmm.
People, they thank me for my service. I just feel I, don't deserve it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, basically, you're part of a very large machine.
Right.
And one of the
It's
things,
just a cog.
yeah, and what even in the Army, I mean, even people who go to Vietnam physically, only about 10% of them or so were actually combat infantry. So,
Right.
and basically, everybody has to do the things they do for the whole system to work. And so part of why we collect these stories is to see all of these different pieces and components to it. Okay. While you were on board the ship, how much communication did you have with people back home?
We wrote letters back and forth all the time. We were allowed to call, but I didn't call that much. Usually when we were in Hawaii, it was like a 13-hour time difference, so it made, hard to find anybody at home at certain times.
Yeah, now when you called, would you use a regular phone line, or would they have some special
They
setup?
had special phones that you could use.
Did they charge you to use them?
You know, I don't remember being charged. I think they were free,
Okay.
yeah.
Because, at least you were calling out of Hawaii in the old days,
Yeah.
long-distance phone calls, that could have gotten very expensive.
Well, I think I did call home on, with the, would you accept my charges? And
Yeah.
usually they did, so. I was the only one in my family to go in the service. My other brothers were, they were in college and stuff like that.
Mhm. Okay. And did you have relatives who'd been in the service, or no other people, or were you really on your own?
I was basically on my own. I had friends that went in,
Mm-hmm.
but, most of them went in the Army. They went, to Vietnam or not. But I didn't know of anybody that actually died in Vietnam.
Okay. How would you characterize morale on board the ship?
We had great morale, yeah. We had, a lot of people thought maybe there'd be a difference between the blacks and the whites, and I didn't see it. We all became good friends.
Yeah. Well, you're all packed in there together, so
Yeah.
if there were a problem, you'd probably know.
Yeah.
Yeah. What proportion of the crew was black, do you think?
Only probably about 10%, yeah.
And those also would have been, were they doing, traditionally, blacks and sailors or whatever, their jobs were being cooks and stewards and not
Well,
much else.
not actually, because most of the stewards and people that did waiting on people were Filipinos.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
most of the blacks, they did the same job
They were
we did.
yeah, by then, because the
Yeah.
Navy had been officially
Yeah.
desegregated for some time.
Right,
and,
yeah.
pretty much was by then.
Of course, at that time, there was no women allowed on the ship, so. Now, it's a different story.
Okay. Did they provide any kind of entertainment or anything on the ship?
When we were in port, especially Long Beach, the USO brought us to Grumman's Chinese Theater a couple times. And then we had to escort USO girls into them, which was quite nice. We had a lot of fun doing that.
Okay. Did they have, show movies on the ship someplace? or something like
Yeah, they put up a bed sheet, and they showed movies almost every night. Of course, they had movies on shore too. They could go to movie houses.
that? Okay. And so you spent most of your career on the prairie, okay? And then eventually you changed ships. And how does that happen?
Well, when I was nearing the end of my 4-year period, and they wanted me to ship over, but I felt that if I probably had stayed in the service, I probably would have been an alcoholic, because alcohol was so cheap. So I decided to get out, but they transferred me the last 4 or 5 months in the service to the USS Warden, which was a guided missile frigate. And I was the lead man in the machine shop there, but I actually never touched the machine while I was there, because they were in port, and they were going to Bath, Maine for refit, so they didn't need anything made, so.
So how did you spend your time?
Well, they had me doing engineering watches most of the time, and I could see I did not like that. You were always down in the engine room, and it was usually 110, 120 degrees there.
Okay. And
Didn't care for that.
what responsibilities did you have there?
Basically, keep the shop clean, and I had one other person underneath me. That was about it. I
Now-
found the living space was quite cramped. It was half what I had on the tender itself.
Yeah, because a frigate is a couple notches smaller than a
Oh, yes.
destroyer. So it'd be,
Well, it's a notch up from a destroyer.
oh,
It's-
okay,
yeah.
the direction, all right.
Yeah,
But it's still relatively
yes, we
slender
only
kind of
had,
ship and,
I think we only had like 175, 200 people on our ship, and it was really crowded, it's cramped conditions.
okay. Now, were you on the ship as it went around to Maine, or did you get off before they left?
I got off before we left. Actually, I only went to sea on the ship one time when they did a dependence cruise. And then they had 2 Air Force jets came and tried to attack us, and we went into zigzag, and and they sent up the guided missiles, and it was quite a show they put on for us. But that was the only time I actually went out to sea with my ship. So.
Okay. And did you go on shore much while you were there? Because there was much going on.
Yeah, we did. We did have a building or a house that we rented. We had like 4 or 5 guys got together, and we rented a house there in San Diego.
Mm-hmm.
And we were home ported in San Diego.
Okay. Now, the people in San Diego, how do they view sailors?
I didn't have a problem there. Basically, it was a military town, so that was money to them. So they treated us nice.
Now, you're in the Navy kind of 65 to 69, and a lot of things go on back home
Right.
During that time. You have an anti-war movement build up. You've got assassinations of Martin Luther King and then Robert Kennedy, and then there's a whole riots in various places and Nixon's election, all of this kind of stuff. To what extent did any of that stuff filter into where you were?
I came home leave when they had the riots in Detroit. And of course, at that time, I only had like 7 or 8 days I was going to be at home. And they had a 10 o'clock curfew. And we didn't have that big, well, not too much was going on in Grand Rapids, mostly in Detroit, but there was some stuff going on in Grand Rapids. I was out chasing women. We had to make the circuit downtown Grand Rapids. And I said, there's no way I'm coming home at 10 o'clock at night. So I was with this one lady, and I stayed with her till like 12 o'clock, and I decided I better go home. And I had somebody follow me. And I believe it was a policeman, but it was in an unmarked car, and they followed me all the way back to my to the farm where I was staying. So that was the only thing I came in contact with as far as the
Okay.
turmoil.
All right. And so basically, on the ships and things like that, none of that news or whatever particularly registered?
They only had one incident, I think, on the ship where a black and another person got into a fight, and I'm not sure what it was over. It might have been over a girl, more than a race.
Yeah. So you're pretty well insulated in a way
Yeah.
from an awful lot of the rest of what's going
Right.
on. Okay. Were you aware of the development of the anti-war movement during that time?
Well, the music, I think, filtered down to us because we listened to the music that they were playing at the time. I didn't feel that myself. I didn't have any negative encounters with anybody after getting out or anything.
Okay. Now, did they make any effort to encourage you to re-enlist?
They offered me like, I think it was like $6,000, and you had a choice of where you wanted to, what coast you wanted to do, either East Coast, West Coast. If you wanted a specific ship or and stay in your field, they wanted you to stay in your field because you were trained for it.
Right.
But other than that, no.
Okay. But you had already basically decided it was not really the way of life that
Right.
would suit you particularly well, so you're going to go back. Okay. Now, you'd mentioned before you got an early out.
Right. They were trying to reduce the amount of people that were in the service at the time. It was in the summer of '69, and they did give me like 2.5 months early out.
Okay. And then, so when you came back home, where were you discharged out of? Was that San Diego? Or?
I was discharged out of San Diego.
Okay. And then how do you get home from there?
Well, at that time I had a Mustang, so I drove.
Okay.
I drove home, and they asked me, "Do you want to stay in or do you want to get out?" And I said, "Well, there's no way I'm staying in." So they said, "Well, go get your physical." And when I went to do my blood pressure, the guy says, "Did they just tell you were getting out?" And I said, "Just, yeah, a few minutes ago." He says, "Come back in an hour." So I did that, and I passed. So yeah, my blood pressure was a little high at the time.
All right.
But then I drove back across country
Okay.
with my car.
All right. And you just went back to work again?
Yeah, actually, I went to work for Oliver Machinery as a machinist there, and worked a couple years there, and then I worked for Land and Company during the day and Oliver at night. So.
Okay. Now, if you think back to the time you spent in the service, both on the ships and in between, are there particular incidents or impressions that kind of stand out for you that you haven't brought into the story here yet?
No, it's just, we did a lot of snorkeling and scuba diving. I bought a aqua lung, so I was into the water sports, beach areas.
Okay. And to look back on that time you spent in the Navy, I mean, how do you think that affected you, or what did you take out of it?
Well, I felt that I appreciated, sending me to the Far East. It was a very nice experience for me, and I learned from it.
What do you think you learned from it or took out from that?
That to get along with other people, that you can work with other people without having diversity. So.
All right. And since you've been back, have you connected with any veterans groups, or do you stay away from that? Or?
Well, we have our own group from the Prairie that they get together. We haven't done it in 5 or 6 years, but we've had 2 or 3 different times where we met out in Las Vegas. We went to St. Louis one time, and we had an excellent time. And we keep losing people, Some of them had contact with Agent Orange, and they've since passed. But yeah, basically, we have a good time.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to share your story today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Okay.
That wasn't so bad.